Page 41 of the 1967 committee minutes. The ink is faded, but the ruling at the top of the page is still legible in clean capital letters. Bait prohibited. Unsporting advantage. The substance those men were so afraid of wasn't a steroid, it wasn't a chemical, it was a raw potato. Cut a specific way, rigged a specific way, dropped in the water in a specific order. I'm going to show you that cut. I'm going to walk you through the file those committee members thought they had buried. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why the American tackle industry has spent 40 years quietly praying you would forget this bait exists. Welcome to Forbidden Lures. 1. The tackle industry's greatest cover-up. Let me open with the money, because money is always where a cover-up starts. A standard pack of soft plastic baits runs you about $9. You get maybe 3 decent sessions before they're torn, lost in a snag, or chewed to ribbons by turtles. Do the math across a year that you're spending over $140 on plastic alone. A raw potato costs 31 cents at the grocery store. 1 potato gives you a full day on the water. And the hook-to-land conversion, the percentage of bites you actually put on the bank, runs several times higher than anything you'll ever get on a commercial artificial in the same conditions. Why? The texture of a raw potato is almost identical to a natural tuber washed off an undercut bank in a storm. When a carp or a channel cat mouths it, nothing in the fish's nervous system says foreign. It holds on for those critical extra seconds. Plastic, they spit out in under half a second. Now here is where it turns ugly. The global tackle industry is a commercial machine. It sells specialized rods, reels, and high-margin synthetic baits in resealable foil bags. Sometime in the early 1980s, that industry made a decision about where its future was. The answer was flavored dough bait, boilies, packaged, branded, patentable, profitable. The raw potato did not fit. It was not flashy. It was not proprietary. And you didn't have to buy it from a tackle shop. So the industry did what industries always do. It stopped talking about the potato. Slowly, quietly, 1 coaching manual at a time. The record is still sitting there if you know where to look. In the 1960s, private English fishing syndicates put the raw potato on an outright banned baits list for their club competitions. The reason they wrote on paper was fair chase. The bait triggered an involuntary feeding response and removed the sporting challenge. The reason they did not write on paper was different. The potato was humiliating gentlemen who had just spent 200 pounds filling a leather tackle bag. Ban the potato and the sport stays profitable. By the time American tournament culture went fully artificials only, the raw potato had become a ghost. 2 generations of bank anglers in this country grew up never hearing its name. But here's what every committee member forgot. The biology of a carp does not read committee minutes. The catfish on the bottom of your reservoir this afternoon is running the same chemoreceptors, the same lateral line, and the same suction feeding system as the fish those old English clubs were so desperate to protect their tournaments from. The file on why this bait works has never been closed. It has only been buried. Let's open it. 2. A forgotten history. The Redmire Revolution. To understand why the industry was so desperate to bury the potato, we go back to 1 small English pond, 1 September afternoon, and 1 carp with a name. The longer story starts earlier. Carp aren't native to the British Isles. They were carried over from mainland Europe in the 12th century by monks, kept in walled stew ponds as food during religious fasting periods. Picture a stone-lined pool behind a monastery, water the color of weak tea, a robed figure pulling supper out with a net. For 600 years, that was the entire identity of carp in England. A kitchen fish. Everything changed in the early 20th century. Selectively bred continental strains began arriving. Bigger, faster growing, longer lived. For the first time, English anglers looked at a carp and didn't see dinner. They saw a fight. They went looking for a bait that could land the largest specimens in the most pressured water. Which brings us to September 1952. A 3-acre farm pond in Herefordshire called Redmire Pool. A rod of split cane bent in the moonlight. And an angler named Richard Walker. Walker wasn't famous yet. That night he was just a man with a theory and a piece of bait. By the time mist lifted off the water, he had landed a 44-pound common carp. A fish so enormous that when the news broke, a large part of the English angling public refused to believe it. Carp, they argued, did not grow that big. The photographs had to be a hoax. They weren't. The fish was real. She was transported alive to London Zoo, where she lived for years on public display. They called her Clarissa, and the sport split into a before and an after. Here is what the history books tend to skip over. What Walker and his closest circle, men like Maurice Ingham, had been testing above every other option for the biggest, oldest, most educated fish in British water was not paste. It was not bread. It was not a commercial bait. It was a carefully cut slice of raw potato dropped in front of fish that had been pressured for 50 straight years. They called the potato the giant killer. And the records from the Redmire era back that name up. More double-figure carp were landed on raw spud during that period than on any other single bait in the angler's arsenal. None of this was classified, but none of it was ever promoted either. In the decades that followed, the commercial industry built itself around a different story, one with product codes, patents, advertising budgets, and television sponsors. A sliced potato doesn't support any of that. A sliced potato is a threat to it. The old men at Redmire knew the potato worked. What they did not know, because the science didn't exist yet, was why it worked. That file wasn't opened until fluid dynamics and fish neurology caught up with the sport. When it did, every strange clause in those 1967 ban sheets started making a great deal of sense. 3. The biochemistry of the starch cloud. Close your eyes for 1 second and picture a single drop of ink falling into a glass of still water. It doesn't sit where it landed. It blooms. It spreads in slow, curling fingers that fill half the glass before you can finish a sentence. That is exactly what a freshly cut potato does underwater. Except the cloud it makes is invisible to your eyes, and impossible for a fish to ignore. Carp and catfish are bottom feeders with a chemical sense so refined, it makes a bloodhound look blunt. They don't hunt by sight. The water in most American reservoirs is too stained for vision to be the primary sense. They hunt by smell and taste dissolved in the water, picked up by a pair of organs called olfactory rosettes sitting just inside their nostrils. Those rosettes carry millions of receptor cells. In the dark, in the mud, in the deepest water of your local lake, they pick up the chemical fingerprint of food from yards away. A raw potato is about 1/5 starch. Starch is a big molecule, two kinds actually. One is a long straight chain like a piece of string. The other branches outward like a tiny tree. The instant you drop a cut piece of potato in the water, both kinds begin dissolving off the cut surface and diffusing outward. The physics rule governing how fast that happens has a name, but you don't need it. What you need is the picture. The molecules spread from the bait in a slow, expanding, three-dimensional fog. To a carp cruising the bottom 2 yards away, that fog means one thing: decomposing organic matter. A feeding event already in progress, and an invitation to join it. A soft plastic lure puts out 0 of this. 0. It's a corpse the moment it enters the water, chemically silent, invisible to the fish's most important sense. A raw potato pumps out that signal continuously for up to 40 minutes per drop. 40 minutes of active broadcast against nothing. Now here is where the old British method turns a very good bait into a lethal one. Before you rig the potato, you soak it. Heavy salt water and a handful of freshly crushed garlic cloves. 10 minutes. The salt loads the surface with amino acids, the exact compounds a fish's taste system is wired to recognize as prey. When that salted potato hits the reservoir, it triggers the same reflex that makes your mouth water when you smell bacon in a hot pan. It primes the suction feed. The garlic is doing something else. Crushed garlic releases a sharp, pungent compound everybody on Earth knows the smell of. In water, that compound is small, fast-moving, and it travels absurdly far. It cuts through the background noise of the reservoir, diesel film, algae bloom, mud, like a flare in a dark sky. This is not folklore. This is a chemistry textbook hiding in plain sight. The committee in 1967 did not ban folklore. They banned a chemistry lesson. Scent will pull a fish into the strike zone, but scent alone will not make it commit. For that, you have to speak to a different sense entirely. A sense most American anglers have never even been told exists. 4. The lateral line and the asymmetric cut. This is the exact part of the file that was scratched out of coaching manuals between 1969 and 1974. Not how to cook the potato. They never cooked it. Not how to flavor it. That stayed. What got quietly deleted year after year was how to cut it. To understand why the cut matters this much, you need to understand a sense that fish have and you don't. Run your finger slowly down the side of the next carp, catfish, or bass you land. You'll feel a faint pale line running from the back of the gill plate to the base of the tail. That isn't a scar. That is an organ. The scientific name is the lateral line, and it is the single most important sensory system on a freshwater predator's body. Picture a row of microscopic hair cells, thousands of them, set along that line in tiny clusters. Each hair cell rests inside its own droplet of soft jelly. When the water around the fish shifts even the smallest amount, those droplets bend. The hair cells bend with them. The fish feels every one. It's a sixth sense so powerful that a fish with both eyes blinded can still school, avoid rocks and logs, and strike at moving prey in total darkness. Water is about 800 times denser than air. Pressure waves in water travel faster and carry further than anything you can imagine from life on land. The lateral line is tuned to the low, slow, heavy frequencies, the frequencies of a living, struggling, injured animal, a wounded shiner, a crayfish missing a claw, a nymph drifting sideways along the bottom. Now, the single most important sentence in this entire video. Rewind it later if you have to. A perfectly cubed piece of potato, 6 even sides, sharp corners, symmetrical, is hydrodynamically dead in the water. It falls in a straight vertical line. It makes one clean, uniform signal. That signal, to the lateral line of a giant carp, says one word: rock. It is indistinguishable from a pebble rolling off an undercut bank. The fish will not even turn its head. An asymmetric wedge, one edge deliberately thin, the opposite edge deliberately thick, does something completely different. As that wedge falls, the current spills off the thin edge faster than the thick edge. The bait tilts. It wobbles. It drifts, rocking side to side like a leaf with a bitten-off corner caught in a slow breeze. To a physics professor, that wobble has a name and a measurable frequency. To a fish, it has a meaning. That specific flutter, at that specific low frequency, is the exact hydrodynamic fingerprint of a wounded prey animal near the bottom. An easy meal. Not going to run. You are triggering a predatory lunge through pure neuroscience before the carp has even visually confirmed what it's looking at. And the committee members who signed those ban sheets? They weren't confused men. They had access to the same research universities the rest of the world did. They knew exactly what that cut was doing. That is precisely why they signed. Here is the rule etched into the inside of your tackle box lid. Drop a cube, you get a pebble's worth of interest. Drop an asymmetric wedge, you ring a dinner bell that a 50-pound carp has been biologically wired to answer since the day it hatched. 5. Predatory mechanics, the 2-second rule. You've called the fish into the area with the scent cloud. You've rung the dinner bell with the wobble. Now comes the single moment 90% of American bank anglers blow every weekend. The strike. Here is the trap. Carp and catfish do not bite their food. Not the way a bass does. Not the way a pike does. They are suction feeders. Picture a small handheld vacuum cleaner switching on for a fraction of a second. That is the mouth of a feeding carp. The fish drops its lower jaw and pulls the floor of its mouth sharply downward. That motion creates a pressure vacuum that literally sucks the bait in from several inches away. Once the bait is inside, the fish doesn't swallow right away. It tastes. It rolls the item around on a sensory organ on the roof of its mouth, testing texture and chemistry. If the organ reports back plastic, unnatural density, strange polymer feel, no starch, the fish spits in under half a second. Ejection. Game over. You, the angler, never even saw the bite on your rod tip. But a raw potato tastes exactly like a potato, because it is a potato. The taste organ doesn't sound any alarms. The fish holds on. It starts to process. It lifts the bait off the bottom to move somewhere safer and eat it. Here's what you feel at your end during this entire sequence. A tap. A short, soft, almost apologetic little tap against the rod tip. That tap is not a bite. I need you to hear that again. That tap is not a bite. That tap is the exact moment the vacuum clicked on and pulled the potato inside the mouth. If you swing the rod right there, and every instinct in your body and every bass video you've ever watched will tell you to, you rip the bait straight out of the fish's mouth before the hook has touched a single piece of flesh. The fish is gone. Spooked. You won't see it again today. You have to wait. This is the rule, and it's the single piece of information that will change your numbers this weekend. When you feel the tap, you do not move. You count. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. Somewhere inside those 2 seconds, your line will do something specific. It will either tighten slowly, the fish has turned and is moving away, or it will fall slack for one short breath. The fish has lifted the bait off the bottom and committed. Either one of those signals is your green light. Now you set the hook. Hard. Rod tip up and over your shoulder, full commitment, drag screwed down. If you did the cut right and the count right, the drag will be screaming before the butt of the rod is back to your hip. 1 tap. 2 Mississippi. Set. Burn it into your muscle memory. It's worth more than any piece of equipment in your bag. 6. Step by step. The forbidden rig enough theory. Let's build it. Step 1. Pick a firm raw potato. Any grocery store. A russet works. A red works. Do not boil it. Do not peel it. Cooking destroys the starch cloud. You'd be throwing a chemically dead bait into the water. The skin is critical. It toughens the hook hold and leaks its own organic compounds. Leave it on. Step 2. The soak. Grab a small container. Fill it with heavy salt water, saltier than seawater. Just pour. Crush 3 or 4 cloves of fresh garlic into the water with the flat of your knife. Cut your potato into rough pieces, then drop them into the brine. Soak 10 minutes. No shortcut. The water will go faintly cloudy as the amino acids leach out. That's the signal the soak is working. Step 3. The cut. This is the part they edited out of the manuals. Take one piece about the size of the last joint of your thumb, roughly 3/4 of an inch across. Now the important part. One edge thin, opposite edge thick. A wedge, not a cube, not a ball. A wedge. If it looks a little uneven when you hold it up to the light, you did it exactly right. This instruction was never printed in any modern American bank fishing handbook. I have gone looking. Step 4. The rig. Pass your hook through the center of the wedge, through the skin on both sides. Not through the soft flesh alone. The skin is what holds the bait under the weight of a cast. Leave just the point of the hook barely showing on the far side. Bury it too deep, the hook won't set. Expose too much, the fish feels metal and drops the bait. Above the hook, use a running lead. The main line passes freely through a hole in the weight instead of being fixed to it. Big carp and big channel cats are paranoid animals. The second they feel unnatural tension from a heavy fixed lead, they drop the bait and don't come back. The running lead was standard in every British carp manual from the 50s onward. Barely mentioned in modern American bank fishing content. That's not an accident. Step 5. The cast. Soft bottom. Slow water or still water. Cast out, rod in a holder. Let the bait sit motionless 35 to 40 seconds. No twitching, no adjusting. You're waiting for the scent cloud to build. Then, and only then, a tiny retrieve. 1.5 inches at most. Just enough to wake the wedge up and start it fluttering. You are not pulling the bait out of your own scent zone. You are ringing the dinner bell inside of it. Now rod tip down, finger on the line, wait, tap. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, set. That is the entire method. Every part of it was common knowledge among serious carpmen in 1952. Every part of it was quietly deleted from the American sport fishing curriculum by 1985. You now know it again. Conclusion. Fishing pressure in this country is higher than it has ever been. Good public water is getting tighter every season, and the tackle industry has the average angler on a hamster wheel. New plastic every spring, new UV coating every summer, new $300 rod every birthday. As long as you keep buying, you keep renting your results from somebody else. But understand what just happened in the last 20 minutes. You did not learn a gimmick. You learned a piece of sport history that somebody, somewhere, decided was not convenient to remember. You learned the chemistry of the starch cloud. You learned what the lateral line does and how to speak to it. You learned the exact asymmetric cut the 1967 committee minutes were written to outlaw. That's not a trick. That's a skill set. And no committee and no industry can take a skill set back out of your hands once you have it. So, next weekend, go find your reservoir. Find your farm pond. Find the stretch of river where the guys with the $300 rods are standing around in a tight group, telling each other the fish just aren't biting today. Pull a 31-cent grocery store potato out of your tackle bag. Cut the wedge the way I showed you. Soak it. Rig it on a running lead. Cast. Wait for the tap. Count your 2 Mississippi. Set. You will know something they don't. If this video opened a file the industry was hoping would stay closed, hit subscribe right now. There are more files, I will keep opening them, one at a time, here on Forbidden Lures, where we fish smarter, not harder, and we don't pay anybody for permission. Drop me a comment below. Tackle shop or raw potato this weekend? I read everyone. See you on the water.